Hi, I'm Skinny Cheeks. Today we'll be going through the Week 4 PTS patch notes. There were some pretty significant changes here, and while I think quite a few of them were good, they don't seem to do much to address the main concerns that we've been pressing them about over the last few weeks. So let's break down the changes, and I'll give my thoughts on where we stand as of Week 4. Starting off with the item set changes, first up we have Pearls. This set now grants Major Heroism for 1.5 seconds, 1 tick of 3 ultimate, after using a healing ability while under 50% of your dominant resource, rather than granting a unique form of 3 ultimate. We're making an adjustment of this set to no longer grant a unique form of ultimate generation to prevent the upper end of ultimate production when specializing in that role. It will still grant the same total amount when it activates, but won't be able to stack with other sources of Major Heroism. Yeah, let's go over the next one and then we'll just cover it all. Pillager's Profit was also changed, reduced the amount of ultimate. This set grants per tick to 2%, down from 5% of the ultimate spent. The developer comment says, we're peeling back some of the raw ultimate generation with this set to better account for its realistic target cap of 11, as well as preparing for how much ultimate generation we're seeing now that builds can better specialize with subclassing. So these are both getting nerfed due to an increase in power enabled by subclassing, and these are the exact type of changes that I was fearing would happen with this new system. Really, this just makes utilizing subclassing for ultimate generation that much more important, and healers that don't just get a huge nerf to their previous setups. Pillagers going down to 2% is a 60% nerf to the set. Holy crap. Maybe it needs to be tuned down a little bit. Geez, that's such a massive nerf, especially since it has that long cooldown on it. So if they aren't happy with the amount of ult gen possible now, I'd much rather see them tackle this creatively in a way that leaves base setups alone. I do hope they'll consider walking this one back a bit. All right, for the new trial sets, we have Harmony and Chaos, increased the amount of weapon and spell damage granted per stack to 135, up from 86. So that will stack up to 675 now, which is pretty good, but you have to take 5 synergies to get there and not go longer than 10 seconds in between each one you take. It's a little bit better than it was, but it still feels pretty hard to keep up. I think most players will probably be getting awful damage out of this set. Then we have the Light Support set, Recovery Convergence, reduce the cooldown of this set to 10 seconds down from 30. Note that the synergy will continue to have a 20-second cooldown. So this set just won't really be used in PvE, sustained solutions will be found elsewhere, but it did probably just get a buff for ball groups in PvP. Next up we have Caspian's Cruel Signet, increase the base damage this set deals by 98%. This set can no longer deal increased damage for each sword active, and by nature can now critically strike because of this. Increased the application cooldown of this set to 500 milliseconds, up from 100 milliseconds. This set now increases your damage done by 1% for every sword active. The developer comment says, we're updating the functionality of this set to be less comparable to something like Azurblight or Reliquin, where each enemy or application scales the damage up, largely since those sets already fill those functions incredibly well. Rather than being an in-between hybrid that doesn't excite nearly as much as either, we're turning this into a damage multiplier for the wearer in high enemy density situations, so all of your damage can increase, similarly to something like Thrive in Chaos. So this one will definitely need some testing. I think it's an interesting concept. I do think I'd prefer maybe 2% damage per sword with a 1-second cooldown instead of the 1% per sword with a half-second cooldown, so that multi-hit direct damage stuff isn't at a huge advantage, and you can still get to a reasonable damage increase with as few as 3 to 4 targets. Right now you'd need a lot of targets just to get a decent percent boost there. But either way, it'll be interesting to see how this one does now. So overall from the gear, aside from this medium trial set that we just went over, which is kind of up in the air still, not really a big fan of their solutions to these issues. All right, next we'll move on to abilities and passives. This first change here might not seem like much at first glance, but there is actually quite a lot to unpack with it. Abilities that are traditionally referred to as beams have been updated to now be considered direct damage rather than damage over time. This affects the following abilities: Radiant Destruction, Fart Carver, Soul Strike, and Vampiric Drain. So this means that Thaumaturge will no longer boost these skills and instead will be using Master at Arms for them. I think it's a pretty interesting change and it will have a decent impact on the way that we set things up. This will also mean that the chance for them to proc status effects will go up, as direct damage has a higher chance than damage over time. For Templars, this is actually a pretty big win, as they were already heavily into direct damage aside from Radiant Destruction. So now you can just spec all into that direct damage and you don't have to worry about a lot of your skills not getting boosted by your champion points. This change will have an effect on some key interactions with skills and gear, so let's go ahead and break that down. For those subclassing into Necromancer, Gravelord Sacrifice and Rapid Rot will no longer boost your beams. This is a pretty massive nerf to that interaction, as those added 25% increased damage. Necro should still be a decent combo to subclass with, as it boosts all your other dots and increases your execute crit chance by quite a bit, but it won't make beam go brrr anymore. For those using a staff on the front bar, lightning staves are definitely the way to go now with beams. It was fairly close before between flame and lightning and would depend on the rest of your build, but now lightning is the clear-cut winner. And then this one's more of a PvP thing, but skills like Corrosive Armor and Onslaught that add to your penetration on direct damage attacks, these will now work for beaming. There are also quite a few item sets that will interact differently with beams now. So for those concerned about Deadly Strike here, this should still work the same as it did before, since it also includes channel abilities in the tooltip. And those beams will just be direct damage channel abilities now instead of damage over time channels. So should be good to go here with Deadly Strike. Probably the biggest impact will be the Maelstrom two-hander Merciless Charge. That 12% direct damage boost is now going to work for your beam abilities. This was already a nice damage increase for Templars in pre-execute range, but now will last all the way through execute as well. And then for the Fate Carver beam, previously two-hander was not very popular for the Arcanist. This is going to change that. And I have a hunch that since Sustain might be a little tight doing this on a stamina character, we might finally see those Magicka-based Arcanists rise up. I do find it a little ironic that due to the current state of the game and hybridization, that Stampede on the back bar sounds more appealing in this scenario for a Magicka character than a stamina one. But when Sustain is part of the equation and all skills deal equal amounts regardless of your main stat, this is just what we often run into. There's also the new set, Tideborn Wildstalker. This is a nice contender here for builds using beams. The 12% is slightly less than the 15% from Deadly Strike. However, due to it being damage done to monsters, it's in a different damage bucket from normal percent damage done increases. So this 12% could actually end up higher than Deadly's 15% depending on what other buffs you have. It does have a penetration line, however, so that can end up wasted. I imagine that overall Deadly in this new Tideborn set will probably perform pretty similarly for beam builds. And the two will be an amazing combo together for those that don't have access to trial sets, or if you're using the Oaken Soul Mythic and you already have Minor Slayer. Narayanith, which used to be a popular set for Templars, will now continue to trigger reliably for them in execute range instead of falling off once you stop jabbing. This also opens it up as an option for Arcanists using Fate Carver if you have room for a monster set. Prior Theoric is another monster set that should also now work with Fate Carver, since that triggers from direct damage with an AoE ability. There were another couple sets I thought about we don't see too often, but these will now work on these beam abilities, Eagle Eye and Wrath of the Imperium. These are 3-piece sets that only come in weapons and jewelry. Unfortunately, Eagle Eye does not drop in melee weapons. Seems like a bit of an oversight, since you have been able to deal ranged direct damage with melee weapons equipped even before this change. And I doubt it would be meta or anything, but it could make for some interesting setups, since it would allow you to run a mythic and a monster set. Harpooner's Waiting Kilt will work now, though I don't see this one getting much use. It has really fallen off a lot in today's game, so I'd love to see this mythic get a rework. Scathing Mage looks a bit interesting. This one also triggers from direct damage. Sadly, I think that 2-piece Magicka bonus is going to hold it back a bit. Then the new Caspian set will also trigger from Fate Carver now, since that requires direct damage. So as we discussed, really not sure if this set will be any good. Definitely check it out on the PTS and let y'all know. Now there were a couple of sets that are negatively impacted by this change. Azurblight Reaper and Rune Carver's Blaze will be pretty ineffective on Fate Carver setups now, as your beam will no longer trigger these sets. Kinda sucks, but there definitely are more new options enabled than what is taken away here. Overall, I think it's a decent change. I'm not really emphatically cheering for it, but I'm not booing it either. I think it does create a bit more positive than negative for the overall game balance, so I'm okay with it. Next up, we have some class-specific changes. So we'll start with the Dragonknight. They got a bit of cost reduction added to their kit. So Start with the Ardent Flame line. Searing Strike, reduce the cost of this ability and its morphs to $22.95. Fiery Breath, reduce the cost of this ability and the Engulfing Flames morph to $29.84. And then Noxious Breath, this morph now applies the poison status effect to all enemies hit by the initial hit. So this is a pretty nice buff. Makes it a fairly solid AoE spammable. It will beat out something like Whirling Blades up until about 35% health remaining. It will also build Seething Fury stacks if you have Molten Whip slotted. For standard rotation applications, you could stagger this at least 4 seconds apart from Venomous Claw in your rotation, and since that has guaranteed poison as well, you'd get 8 seconds of guaranteed poison instead of the 4 that you get right now. So I think it's a pretty nice change. It's not going to make a significant impact, but it gives more of a reason to use the Noxious Breath morph now. In the Draconic Power line, Dark Talons reduce the cost of this ability and the Burning Talons morph to $31.50, and then Choking Talons, the cost reduction bonus from this morph, now takes the cost to $32.40. So it is nice that it's cheaper now, but unfortunately there's just not a good enough reason for a damage dealer to take this skill line anymore. For Necromancer, we just have a bug fix here with the Pummeling Goliath ultimate. Fixed an issue where this morph's special bash attack did not work for non-Necromancer classes. Then for the Sorcerer, we have the Daedric Summoning line. For bound armaments, they reverted the previous 10% damage reduction made during the first week of the PTS, so I'm really glad they went back on this one. It should be pretty decent now with the change to also allow up to 8 stacks now. I don't see it as appealing as a skill like Grim Focus still, but it's moving in the right direction at least. For Dark Magic, we have Dark Exchange. This ability and its morphs now break stealth and invisibility immediately upon activation rather than not removing it at all. Not a big fan of this. I feel like self buffs like this should not take you out of invisibility, but it is what it is. For the Stormcalling line, we have Lightning Splash. This ability and its morphs synergy can now be self-synergized to make the abilities feel less like a sacrifice for the caster to run. Yo, this is a really nice change for sorcerers. Hopefully this will encourage the skill to be run more, as it actually does pretty good damage when you account for the synergy. This change also allows you to interact with gear that requires synergy activations even if you aren't in a group. For example, you could run Avid Boneyard in one of the Lightning Splash morphs and stagger those synergy activations 10 seconds apart and keep up Alkosh all by yourself. Next up, we have Templars, the Dawn's Wrath skill line. Radiant Destruction, this ability and its morphs now last for 3.8 seconds in total, down from 4.8 seconds. Reduce the cost per tick to 1080, so the cost per second remains the same over the total duration and tick rate. Increase the base damage by 4%. Increased the health threshold the execute scaling starts at to 33%, up from 30%. Increased the status effect chance per tick to 6%, up from 3%. Radiant Glory, reduced the cost of this morph to be a 40% cost reduction, up from a 33.3% cost reduction. Reduce the healing done to 15% of this damage done, down from 20%. Radiant Oppression, this morph's execute scaling now starts at 40%, up from 39%. Developer comment says, we're peeling back the commitment time by 1 second to try and better accommodate for rotation timing and item set interaction, so things like stack-based sets don't have such a short window before they'd fall off. In addition to this, we're also gently bumping up the damage the abilities can do to help get some of their power back in from before. Radiant Glory now sacrifices a little bit of its healing potency in exchange for a further cost reduction, so it's a tiny bit easier for non-Magicka focused builds to utilize, while Oppression sees a slight boost in power to make it a little clearer on when to start its use, but with less of a DPS delta between the morphs. Overall, I definitely think this is a few steps in the right direction. We'll have to see how it performs overall, but it should help a fair bit. I am curious if the tick rate is a little higher now, because they said they reduced the cost to 1080, so the cost per second remains the same. So in my mind, I think that means it ticks slightly faster now, but we'll have to hop on the PTS and see. It was ticking a little bit slower on average over the 4.8 seconds than on the live servers over the 1.8 seconds, so maybe it's back to normal now. Next up, we have Warden. In the Winter's Embrace line, we have Piercing Cold. Increased this passive's increased the frost damage to 15%, up from 10%. We're temporarily inflating the damage of this passive to influence frost damage a bit more aggressively than we'd like, until we can find a better long-term solution, like more sources of frost damage in general, for those who wish to wield the cold like a weapon. I'm a little concerned with the developer comment here. Why don't you like that? Like, what is wrong with having a nice strong increase to frost damage? And while we're at it, why not not buff Stormcalling's shock damage to 15% as well. These are the kind of fun thematic lines that are working really well and players are enjoying, but for some reason we're shying away from this. I think Winter's Embrace is a really awesome line. It has a very coherent theme, it has varied passives and skills offering both offensive and defensive power, and you can take it on multiple roles. And I think this should be the way that pretty much all of the skill lines work. This whole stacked with skills and passives for a specific role just doesn't fit into this system without sacrificing way too much in thematic expression. So yeah, I really like this. They've finally made Frost abilities worth running over Flame abilities for someone going into a Frost build, and that just wasn't the case before. So I hope they'll revisit the line of thinking where they say this is more aggressive than they'd like. If anything, I could see it going up even higher. So I'm kind of on the opposite end of that, and I think a lot of players are as well. So overall, most of the ability changes aren't bad. I actually liked the majority of them here, but they don't really do much to resolve the big outstanding issues with subclassing that have been brought up over the last few weeks. The biggest issue for me is that the desirable lines are mostly broken up right now into roles instead of themes, though there are a couple of nice exceptions. As a damage dealer, players have enjoyed 21 skill lines across the different classes. Now that number realistically goes to about 10. And you could say, oh, there are other benefits in those crossed off lines, but sadly the benefits aren't nearly enough to warrant the massive damage loss you get for taking them over the highlighted options. So if you are only into easy content and you don't have a team relying on you, it's fine, I guess, anything goes there. But for those that want to feel like they're pulling their weight for group play, this is a disaster for diversity. This wouldn't be so bad if so many of these lines didn't have awesome themes and skills for dealing damage within them. Sadly, many abilities are just going to end up left for dead, such as Burning Talons, Eruption, Ghostly Embrace, Dark Shade, Debilitate, Crystal Fragments, Ritual of Retribution, and the list goes on. This is just to name a few. You get the point. And before you say, well, this sounds like a min-max DPS problem, this is actually worse for tanks and healers. They will have even less skill lines to choose from for their roles without feeling like they're just picking a dead line. And while I won't say I know what the best choices in PvP will turn out to be, I'm guessing it's also going to be quite limited. Point of all of this is to say, yes, you could just pick stuff that isn't as good and live with that, but this system should be able to support a balance that is way better than it is currently, and you shouldn't have to make the decision to sacrifice 30% of your damage if you want to stick with your full base class, or even more of a loss if you actually prefer some of those suboptimal lines and want a combination of those together. That's just way too big of a gap, and I think over the last few weeks of the PTS, we've presented a lot of possible ways to fix that. So again, the skill changes listed are not bad, but they don't really resolve much. So I do hope this is something that the developers are willing to keep plugging away at until it lands in a better spot. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what y'all think about subclassing so far, and if you think I missed any important interactions that came from the week 4 changes. Big shout out to my Patreon and YouTube members. Really appreciate the support. And a special thanks to these folks here. I couldn't keep doing this without you. I'll see y'all in the next one. Bye.